The Outlaw Motorcycle Club, also known as the Outlaws, stands out as one of the oldest and most infamous one-percenter motorcycle clubs in the world. The term one-percenter describes, quote, the 1% of bikers that don't follow the rules. They don't follow laws. They don't answer to anybody. Founded in 1935 in McCook, Illinois, the Outlaws is the third largest motorcycle club globally, with 441 chapters across 43 different countries. Each chapter of the Outlaws has a leadership structure, including elected officials like a president, vice president, secretary-treasurer, and an enforcer. And all members, aside from chapter presidents, take turns providing continuous armed security for their clubhouses. Membership in the Outlaws is exclusive, with only white males allowed to join. Every member must own an American-made motorcycle, most notably a Harley-Davidson, and keep it in top condition to meet the exclusive criteria set by the Outlaws. To become an official outlaw, a prospective member must be sponsored by a current full member of the club, also known as a patch-wearing member. New prospects undergo a 6-month probation period, and to become a patch-wearing member, they must receive approval from the existing club members through a unanimous vote. Prospects wear a probationary patch with the words Probationary Outlaw written on the back, and patch-wearing members wear several distinctive patches, collectively referred to as their colors. These include a patch with the 1% symbol, and another featuring the Outlaws' iconic Charlie logo, which consists of a skull and crossed pistons. Outlaws are expected to protect their patches at all costs and guard them with their lives. In fact, anything which has the Charlie logo must never touch the floor. After 1 year of membership, members may choose to get various tattoos associated with the club, such as God Forgives, Outlaws Don't, or the 1% symbol. Upon reaching the 5-year mark, members are allowed to have full-size replicas of their colors tattooed on their backs. The club holds weekly church meetings, which all patch-wearing members are required to attend. Additionally, members participate in various runs, which are motorcycle trips that can last for several days. These runs are categorized into national, regional, and local events, with national runs happening 3 to 4 times annually, regional runs taking place between 5 and 20 times annually, and local runs taking place weekly. Members pay monthly dues, and also have to pay fees for each run. Plus, when one of the Outlaws needs legal help, all members are generally charged a fee to help cover the costs. Since membership within the Outlaws is exclusive to men, women are prohibited from joining the ranks. A woman who associates with an outlaw is typically referred to as that outlaw's old lady, essentially his property. In certain instances, a woman might be considered the club's collective property. An old lady who is patched wears a special patch that indicates she belongs to a specific outlaw. Outlaw members may have multiple old ladies, each holding a distinct rank in terms of responsibility and privileges, with the number 1 old lady typically being the one with the most responsibility and generally the most privileges. In some cases, members may even trade or sell their old ladies among themselves. The number 1 old lady plays a critical role in educating newer old ladies about their roles and duties within the Outlaws. These include working and giving their earnings to their outlaw man, following any orders from the Outlaws without question, staying out of trouble, and avoiding drugs unless specifically permitted by an outlaw. The number 1 old lady is also responsible for collecting personal information about the new women, which can later be used to intimidate or threaten them if they ever attempt to escape. Many old ladies are forced into working as nude dancers or prostitutes, and are then expected to give all their earnings to their outlaw partner. Sometimes an old lady may be able to buy her freedom, but the Outlaws have different methods to control the women and stop them from leaving. For example, they may keep a woman dependent on them by supplying her with drugs and limiting the amount of money she's allowed to keep. This creates a cycle of dependency, where the old lady may find it incredibly difficult to leave. When an old lady breaks the rules, whether by withholding earnings, trying to leave, or any other form of disobedience, the Outlaws have various ways of punishing her. She may be physically beaten, or threatened with being sold to another outlaw. In more serious cases, the punishment involves training. This training may include sending her to a prostitution lockup at a truck stop. In these lockups, the old lady is on call for prostitution 24 hours a day, often for weeks at a time. The money she earns is split between the truck stop owner and the outlaw who owns her. Other forms of training could involve physical beatings with an axe handle and gang rape by the outlaw chapter members. The man behind the South Florida Outlaws is James Thomas Nolan, often referred to as Big Jim. He was born around 1943 in New Jersey, and he later moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 1955. In the early 1960s, Big Jim founded the Iron Cross motorcycle gang in West Palm Beach and was a president of the gang when the Chicago-based Outlaws sent Donald Deke Tanner to Florida in 1967 to start a chapter there. Big Jim worked with Deke to merge several local biker gangs such as the Iron Cross, the Cossacks, the Half-Breeds, and the Outcasts to form the Outlaws South Florida chapter. In July 1967, a patch-over ceremony was held at Kitty's Saloon, a local bar near Juneau Beach. The South Florida Outlaws then began using Kitty's Saloon as their clubhouse, and the members lived in several cabins located behind the bar, which were rented from the saloon's owner, Bertha Kitty Randall. Initially, Big Jim held the role of vice president in the South Florida chapter, while Deke served as president. The chapter garnered significant infamy following a brutal incident in November 1967, when 5 members cruelly crucified a young woman in Jupiter. Christine Deese was in a relationship with Norman Spider Reisinger, one of Big Jim's top enforcers. Norman became enraged when Christine failed to pay him $10 he believed she owed him. On the afternoon of November 14, 1967, he, along with 4 fellow outlaws, Francis Fat Frank Link, Don Mangy Graves, Joe Squirrel Sorsby, and John Crazy Johnny Wobbles, kidnapped Christine from Kitty's Saloon. They beat her and then nailed her to a tree in the woods, releasing her after 15 minutes and oddly congratulating her for not screaming for help. Christine reported the brutal incident to the local police, leading to the issuance of arrest warrants for all 5 men. Unlike Norman and Francis, who were members of the Florida chapter, Don, Joe, and John were from the Detroit chapter of the Outlaws. Norman and Francis were arrested within days of the assault, while Don, Joe, and John managed to evade capture for 2 weeks before they were eventually found hiding out with the Renegades, an Outlaws-affiliated club in Detroit. After their extradition to Florida, the trio was confronted by Florida Governor Claude R. Kirk Jr. in a cargo holding area at the Fort Lauderdale airport. Governor Kirk vowed to eradicate the gang from the state of Florida. In response to Governor Kirk's vow, Big Jim said in an interview, "So we have long hair and beards. Well, so did Jesus Christ, and he's been around a lot longer than Governor Kirk." During the 1968 trial, Don testified against the others in exchange for probation. Ultimately, the other defendants were convicted and received prison sentences, though none exceeded 6 years. Despite Governor Kirk's promise to eradicate the Outlaws from Florida, he was only able to shut down Kitty's Saloon. The South Florida Outlaws then relocated to Fort Lauderdale, and the chapter operated from a clubhouse in an unincorporated area southwest of the city, boasting around 200 members and associates at its peak. The South Florida Outlaws clubhouse had armed club members maintaining round-the-clock security, and it's been reported that the clubhouse was always stocked with an arsenal of firearms and explosives stored in a secure place known as the Toy Box. Big Jim was the president of the Fort Lauderdale chapter and the regional president of the Outlaws in Florida for over a decade. During Big Jim's time as president, one key rule was that no member could ever retire from the club. Even after his reign ended, any member attempting to leave the Outlaws faced serious threats of harm to themselves and their families. Under Big Jim's leadership, the Outlaws shifted their focus from pimping to drug trafficking because, quote, drugs don't talk back. Frederick Yankee Hegney, originally from Queens, New York, moved to South Florida in 1973, and although he didn't officially join the Outlaws until 1980, he played a crucial role in the club's drug trafficking operations throughout the 1970s. Frederick eventually became the vice president of the South Florida chapter. When it came to drugs, the Outlaws preferred to deal with their own members, because it minimized the risk of getting caught by the police. However, if an outlaw had to interact with someone outside the club, they would often make their affiliation known, using intimidation to ensure silence and compliance. Drugs were dealt directly from the clubhouse and during the Outlaws' motorcycle runs, whether local, regional, or national. If outlaw members were incarcerated, the club would support them by supplying narcotics to them, whether it be for personal use or to sell to other inmates. The old ladies, who were involved in the club's operations, played an important role in the narcotics trade. They helped by counting, repackaging, and sometimes smuggling drugs into prisons. The profits from drug dealing were substantial and allowed the Outlaws to use the money to fund their club, including the purchasing of at least one of their clubhouses. During a stint in prison, Big Jim was quoted as saying, "I'd rather be an outlaw in the penitentiary than some jerk on the street." On December 24, 1970, Susan Gale Bacon, a 31-year-old secretary, spent the evening socializing and bar hopping with friends. Later that night, she met members of the Outlaws at the Sandbox Bar, where she played a game of pool with one of them. Susan ended up leaving the bar with 3 carloads of gang members. The group first visited a home in Fort Lauderdale before heading to a party at the home of Outlaw member Henry Funky T. Amos in Pompano Beach. Among the guests at this party were other outlaws like Edward Grubby Summers and James Blue Starrett, alongside members of the Ohio's Legion of Hell motorcycle gang, Larry Shotgun Shockey and Rudolph Lee Lunsford. During the party, Susan got into an argument with one of the outlaws, and she ended up slapping him. James then retaliated by hitting Susan multiple times across the face with the back of his hand and kicking her in the head. Later in the evening, some outlaws took her to a bedroom with the intention of training her. After the brutal incident, someone offered her a ride home. However, Susan insisted instead on going to the police station to report what had happened to her that night. Upon hearing this, James threatened Susan, saying that he would feed her to the gators. The next morning, in the early hours of December 25th, James and Larry drove Susan to the secluded C. Robert Markham Park. Larry removed the safety catch on a shotgun, and James then shot Susan twice in the chest at close range, once with the shotgun and once with a handgun, while Larry remained in the car. Susan Gale Bacon's body was discovered on December 28, 1970, slumped by some coral at the park. An autopsy showed that a shotgun blast had shattered her shoulder, and a small caliber bullet had pierced her heart. James Starrett and Larry Shockey were charged with the first-degree murder of Susan. Edward Summers was also initially charged with first-degree murder, but later had the charges dropped against him. Rudolph Lee Lunsford testified in a preliminary hearing about Edward's role in the murder, stating that he had loaded the shotgun into the trunk and later wiped the house in an attempt to get rid of any potential fingerprints. After the testimony is when the first-degree murder charge against Edward got dropped, and he got charged with accessory after the fact instead. James was eventually found guilty in state court of third-degree murder in 1971 and received a 20-year sentence, but he managed to escape from a prison hospital in 1974 while serving his sentence. With the help of several members of the Outlaws, he fled to Canada. It was later discovered that he was living in St. Catharines under the alias Charlie Brown, and he operated a painting business and was a member of the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. Later, James returned to the U.S. and turned himself in to law enforcement. Once released from prison, he became a key drug courier for 2 Florida chapters. Between 1979 and 1980, James transported marijuana to both Illinois and Wisconsin. In 1980, he attempted to deliver Quaaludes, cocaine, and speed to Oklahoma, but that shipment was unsuccessful. Law enforcement seized the drugs shortly after they arrived, leading to James being partially blamed for the loss by other outlaws. In February 1981, he transported approximately 100 pounds of marijuana to Arizona for Big Jim, but some of that shipment was also lost. These incidents, among others, ultimately led to James leaving the Outlaws in bad standing. In 1974, the Outlaws and the Hells Angels were in the middle of a violent feud that had started the previous year. The rivalry started after 2 members of the Aliens biker gang from New York City decided to split. Sandy Alexander chose to join the New York Hells Angels, and Peter Greased Lightning Rogers decided to join the Chicago Outlaws. During a trip to New York for a New Year's Eve gathering in 1973, Peter was brutally assaulted by Sandy. The assault was allegedly triggered by accusations that Peter had sexually assaulted Sandy's wife. To save face, Peter told the other outlaw members that he had been ambushed by numerous Hells Angels members. In the spring of 1974, Big Jim learned that 3 members of the Hells Angels chapter from Lowell, Massachusetts were in South Florida. After the 1973 assault on Peter Rogers, Angel Oski Simmons decided to leave the Lowell chapter of the Hells Angels, and he moved to Florida to run a motorcycle shop. Hells Angels members Whiskey George Hartman and Edwin Riverboat Riley were reportedly in Florida to oversee Angel remove his Hells Angels tattoos, and an FBI informant later said that they were there to recover club gear from him. Authorities suspected that George and Edwin were also looking to source drugs during their visit. Big Jim had a meeting with the other outlaws, as he was concerned about the Hells Angels being in their territory. After learning that George, Edwin, and Angel would be at Pastime Bar in Fort Lauderdale on April 30th, 1974, Big Jim and a group of South Florida outlaws went there to confront them. Following a tense conversation, Big Jim suggested that they take the conversation off the street and convince the Hells Angels to leave the bar and come to the Outlaws' clubhouse under the pretense that they would sell them drugs, assuring them that they would not be hurt. However, once the Hells Angels arrived at the clubhouse, Big Jim ordered several outlaws to take them to a deserted area, instructing them to, quote, make sure they don't come back. In line with Big Jim's orders, Henry Amos, Gatemouth Willie Edson, Norman Reisinger, and Ralph Lucifer Yanata held the Hells Angels at gunpoint, forced them into a van, bound them, and drove them to a water-filled rock pit in the Everglades. This area was described as dense and remote. Measuring approximately 100 yards in length and 50 feet wide, the pit is about 20 feet deep. There are no buildings located near the rock pit, and it is primarily used for target practice. Once there, as the Hells Angels were bound and gagged, they were each shot with a 12-gauge shotgun in the back of the head. Their bodies were then weighed down with concrete blocks and dumped into the water, hidden amidst the gravel. On May 1st, 1974, a man named Stanley McElroy was target shooting in the rock pit area when he saw what appeared to be a human foot sticking up from the water. He promptly drove to a nearby gas station and called the police. After arriving at the scene, Broward Sheriff's Deputy Frank Gaddis saw a severed foot still attached to a body and later sent divers into the rock pit, who said that finding anything in the rock pit would be difficult because the bottom is covered with grass and weeds. The divers initially only recovered a pair of sneakers. However, Sheriff Sergeant Robert Bushong, who is trained as a diver, went underwater and found 2 more bodies tied to cinder blocks. The bodies were identified through their fingerprints and tattoos. In response to this, notorious Hells Angels godfather Sonny Barger declared an all-out war against the Outlaws. Before the Outlaws got indicted for the triple murder, Willie had been accused of almost beating a woman to death because she was the girlfriend of a Bandidos member, and of torturing a woman for wearing an Outlaws patch without permission. He escaped from a Florida prison, and with help from his fellow outlaws, he fled to Kitchener, Canada, where he went by the alias Dennis Lupo, and joined a local Satan's Choice motorcycle club chapter. Willie was arrested in Kitchener on August 27, 1976, and was subsequently deported back to the United States. In April 1978, Henry Amos, Willie Edson, Norman Reisinger, Ralph Yanata, and Big Jim got indicted by a grand jury, all charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Willie ended up becoming a key government witness and agreed to testify against his fellow outlaws in the murder of the 3 Hells Angels. Willie ended up receiving immunity for the triple murder in exchange for his testimony. At the time he was indicted, Big Jim was incarcerated in a county jail as he appealed a 5-year prison sentence he had received earlier that same year for state drug offenses and for threatening to sick his 150-pound Great Dane on a police officer in Hollywood, Florida. The triple homicide case against Big Jim was built on the testimony of outlaw gang members and killers involved in the triple homicide, Willie Edson and Ralph Yanata, along with 2 other outlaws, John Igor Luce and Dale Brackett Webb. They agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. During the time of the trial, Willie was serving a 20-year sentence for the torture of the woman. John was serving a 20-year sentence for assaulting a woman with a table leg. Dale, a former president of the Orlando chapter, was facing life in prison for kidnapping and has been implicated in 2 murders in Orange County. And Ralph was serving 4 concurrent life sentences for murder. Willie and Ralph both admitted to their roles in the murders, and Willie implicated himself, Ralph, Norman, and Henry as the shooters who were instructed by Big Jim to kill the 3 Hells Angels. Ralph testified after Willie did, and subsequently entered the witness protection program. During the trial, the jurors were handed the images of the 3 victims, who had been submerged in water for days. Several jurors were extremely disturbed. One juror rolled her eyes and gasped as she quickly glanced at a photo. Big Jim's first trial for the murders was concluded on December 22, 1978, with a deadlocked jury, which split 10-2 in favor of conviction. A subsequent retrial in March 1979 also resulted in a mistrial. Ultimately, Big Jim was acquitted in a 3rd trial later that year, as he presented a defense that the prosecution's witnesses, who were other outlaws, claimed to be fabricated. Henry Amos was convicted of the murders and was sentenced to life in prison. He was stabbed to death in a prison yard fight nearly a decade later. Ralph Yanota was also sentenced to life in prison for the murders. After being indicted by the grand jury, Norman fled and went on the run, and a warrant for his arrest was issued in 1978. He was on the FBI's wanted list and managed to evade capture for 13 years. In 1991, Norman and another gang member were riding their motorcycles on Interstate 65 in Merrillville, just across the state line from Chicago. They were driving erratically, weaving in and out of traffic, and began tailgating a car with two women inside. This prompted Indiana State Trooper Dwayne Dillahunty to pull them over. Norman claimed that his female passenger urgently needed to use the toilet, and the trooper allowed him to take her to a nearby exit to find a bathroom. After Norman drove off, the trooper conducted a background check based on his Texas driver's license, which had the name Joe Sorsby, which was an alias that Norman had used for many years. The trooper was taken aback when the system flagged Norman as one of America's most wanted. The trooper said, quote, "I thought they did that as a ploy to get away, but no, he did come back and I called for backup and then arrested him." State Trooper Dillahunty was able to definitively identify Norman due to his distinct scars and tattoos which read "Born to Raise Hell, Outlaws Forever" in Chicago. Norman was then held at the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. The only public information available about Norman after this incident is from 1991, as he was being held in jail awaiting his extradition hearing. No public information about Norman had been published after this. In August 1974, Joyce Karleen became involved with the South Florida Outlaws after traveling to Daytona Beach, Florida, in search of employment. She was approached by two men who invited her to accompany them to Hollywood, Florida, where they promised to get her a job. Upon arriving in Hollywood, the two men took Joyce to a trailer, which she later learned was the Outlaws' clubhouse. There she met Big Jim and another outlaw, Donald Gangrene Sears. On Joyce's first day at the clubhouse, Big Jim asked her to get him a beer. When she refused and told him that if he wanted a beer, then he should get it himself, Big Jim hit her. The following day, Big Jim approached Joyce again, this time displaying a gun, and took her to a back room so he could fill her in on the obligations of being an outlaw's old lady. In the back room, he explained that as part of her association with the club, she would be expected to work and provide her earnings to the outlaws, and she would have to do as she was told. Big Jim then held a gun to her head and forced her to perform oral on him. He then raped Joyce, and after he left the back room, 8 other outlaws entered the room and also proceeded to rape her. Big Jim had warned her to obey and do exactly what she was told, or he would beat her. When Joyce struggled against her attackers, Big Jim returned to the room and punched her in the mouth. The very next day, Joyce was taken to a local lounge and forced to work as a topless dancer, alongside the other old ladies. Later that week, on August 22, 1974, Joyce was accused by members of the club of stealing clothing that were marked with a property patch that belonged to one of their patched old ladies. In response, several outlaws abducted her after her shift at the lounge and took her back to the clubhouse. There, they tied her to a chair and ripped her blouse off. They subjected her to physical abuse, including taking turns punching and kicking her, and burning her with a hot spoon repeatedly on her arms and breasts. After they had finished torturing Joyce, the outlaws covered her head with a sheet and brought the other old ladies into the room. The outlaws pulled the sheet from over Joyce's head, and they made it clear to the old ladies that this could happen to them if they disobeyed orders and misbehaved. Joyce was later dumped in a remote field. Despite the severe injuries she sustained, Joyce survived and reported the incident to law enforcement. Several members of the Outlaws were subsequently convicted for their involvement in the assault. Naomi Sinalcub was in her early 20s and was Donald's old lady during the time Joyce was staying at the Outlaws' clubhouse. Naomi witnessed the abuse that Joyce suffered at the hands of the Outlaws and was actually one of the old ladies the Outlaws brought into the back of the clubhouse before Joyce was dumped into the field. Shortly after this incident, Naomi decided to leave the clubhouse and fled. Big Jim contacted other outlaws, including Donald, and told them to look for her because he was concerned that she would testify or give the police information about the torture of Joyce and their prostitution ring. After Donald found Naomi, Big Jim decided to initially take her to Miami and hide her there, but later ordered Donald to kill her. Donald and another outlaw Richard "Dirty Dick" Brainerd, took her out on Richard's fishing boat, where they shot her twice in the head. The exact details of what happened next remains unclear. Reports suggest they either cut her throat and abdomen and weighed her body down with a heavy object and dumped her in the Atlantic Ocean, or that they had dragged her body behind the boat until it disintegrated. Sadly, Naomi's body was never found, and no charges were filed against anyone for the murder. However, her case played a crucial role in a RICO case that led to the downfall of the South Florida Outlaws in 1988. In the late 1970s, Tina Wittenstein was Big Jim's old lady, and she worked as both a prostitute and occasionally as a topless dancer. In July of 1977, Tina escaped from the Outlaws with the help of one of her regular clients, Vaughn Foreman. They managed to stay out of South Florida for about a month, but they eventually returned to the area. When Big Jim discovered that they had returned, he captured Tina and held her at his house under armed surveillance. Big Jim informed fellow outlaw, Thomas Belcher, that he was holding Tina for a $20,000 ransom, intending to collect the money from Vaughn. Big Jim then sent other outlaws to track down Vaughn, who was subsequently found and taken to the home of another club member. At the outlaw's home, Vaughn was severely beaten in the face with the butt of a shotgun and had a lit cigarette stubbed out in his eye. He then had the barrel of the shotgun put into his mouth and was told to beg for his life. When Big Jim got to the house where Vaughn was being held, Big Jim told him that he wanted his property, meaning Tina, back. Vaughn professed his love for Tina and told Big Jim that he wanted to be with her. Big Jim then told Vaughn that he will sell her to him for $100,000 and that he would not release her until he was paid. Big Jim forced Vaughn to stay with the Outlaws for several days while he gathered the money. Eventually, Vaughn was able to pay him $40,000 and Big Jim released both him and Tina. Vaughn then paid an additional $20,000 but stopped paying after he and Tina got married later that year in the fall of 1977. The couple then fled to California to escape Big Jim and the Outlaws. On April 19, 1977, at around 1 a.m., 27-year-old James Taylor Thomas, a 3-year police veteran with the Dania Police Department, had driven to the Lil General store located at 4551 Griffin Road to pick up his brother-in-law, Kenneth Hanna. Outlaw members Ellenson Hobo Thompson and Robert Moonshine Watts planned an armed robbery at the Lil General store that night. Initially, the robbery was supposed to be a basic armed robbery. However, when Kenneth Hanna, the Lil General store clerk, didn't have enough cash, they flew into a rage and ended up shooting Kenneth in the hand. After they had seen James in the parking lot, they said, "You'll do, N-word," then put a gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. The two outlaws then fled the scene in a blue sedan. Later that morning, once Ellenson and Robert realized that their victim was an off-duty police officer, they fled the state on their motorcycles. A few weeks later, Robert was decapitated in a motorcycle accident in his hometown of Kentucky. Over 5 years later, John Knucklehead Turner, a fellow biker, was arrested for the murder in Gastonia, North Carolina, after his wife turned him in, saying that she had endured one beating too many. However, John was later acquitted. Ellenson was later identified as the shooter, but he remained a fugitive, and he managed to evade capture for 16 years. Ellenson likely spent a significant portion of his 16 years evading capture within the biker underground and in parts of Central America. He was using the alias Grover Wayne Ellenson when he was picked up for driving under the influence in Augusta, Georgia in March 1993. He was booked and released, but his fingerprints were sent to Washington, and law enforcement got a hit on an Ellenson Thompson. When they realized that he was wanted for the murder of a cop, they prioritized capturing him. For nearly a year, from May 1992 until March 1993, Ellenson was employed as a generator mechanic at High Tech Power Systems in Augusta, a company focused on selling and servicing generators, and authorities were able to trace him using his employer. They also managed to trace him through a relative living in a rural area close to Anderson, South Carolina. On July 7, 1993, Ellenson was spotted driving his 1984 Ford Ranger pickup along Interstate 95 heading toward Greenville, and was followed by FBI agent Michael Wernick, who called for backup. He and 2 other agents later arrested him. Ellenson admitted to the agents who he was and knew why he was wanted, but he didn't reveal anything else and didn't resist. Quote, "We took him by surprise, and he didn't have time to think about it." Ellenson Thompson was charged with murder, extortion, and drug distribution. In 1980, while Big Jim was incarcerated at Florida State Prison for drug charges, an outlaw named Ronald Arab Watchmaker introduced him to Iris Jogen. Ronald intended to offer Iris to Big Jim as a gift upon his release. However, while Big Jim was still in prison, Ronald gave him control of 49% of Iris, with the remaining 51% available for purchase. Big Jim offered Ronald $2,000 for full control of Iris, and Ronald allowed her to choose which outlaw she would prefer to be with. Believing that being Big Jim's number 1 old lady would afford her better privileges than being Ronald's number 2 lady, Iris chose Big Jim. While he was still incarcerated, Iris lived at Big Jim's Fort Lauderdale home, where an outlaw named Michael Moldy Mike Cave was also living and had been assigned to keep an eye on her. Iris struggled to find a job as a topless dancer, leading Michael to suggest she work as a nude dancer instead. When she told him that she was uncomfortable with this idea, Michael threatened to put a dog collar on her and make her dance naked around the house until she became comfortable with the idea. On another occasion, while visiting a friend in Key West, Iris returned home to find Michael waiting for her. He hit her and threatened that if she attempted to escape again, he would find her mother, sodomize her, and take photos of the assault. While Big Jim was still in prison, Iris visited him regularly, and she would smuggle drugs, such as cocaine and marijuana, into the prison for him. These drugs were used for Big Jim's personal use and for sale to other inmates. After Big Jim's release in September 1980, he divided his time between Fort Lauderdale and Tucson, Arizona, where he was hoping to expand Outlaws' operations to. He managed to successfully persuade the parole board that he was employed by David Allen Coe, a country musician and a fellow member of the Outlaws, but his actual income in Arizona came from prostituting his old ladies and dealing drugs. In Arizona, Big Jim was accompanied by other members of the Outlaws, who began to supply prostitutes to local topless bars. Big Jim managed to convince Iris to move with him to Arizona, as he promised her a honeymoon period of 30 days during which she would not have to work as a prostitute, and he would not bring other old ladies into their home. However, once in Arizona, Big Jim did not honor these promises. Iris was required to continue working as a prostitute, and he did bring other old ladies into their home. During their time together in Arizona, Big Jim became physically abusive toward Iris. On one occasion, when Iris was upset, he asked her what was wrong, and she said that her feelings were hurt because Big Jim had not kept a date with her. He then went ballistic. He punched her in the eye, threw his boot at her, and took the money she had earned from prostitution that night and forced the cash down her throat. On another occasion, when Iris couldn't find a bag of marijuana that she had hid, which Big Jim intended to sell, he violently hit her in the chest and back with his fists, breaking one of her ribs. Iris eventually convinced him to let her go to the hospital, but only after she agreed to invent a fake story to explain her injuries to medical staff. One night, Big Jim was inhaling nitrous oxide and passed out. When Iris took the tube from his mouth and began inhaling it herself, he woke up, and after seeing that she had taken the tube from him, he yelled at her, telling her that if she was going to behave like a man, then she would be beaten like one. He then proceeded to knock her down to the ground, kick her, pick her up only to knock her down again, drag her by the hair into the bedroom, and forcefully push the barrel of a handgun into her mouth. In January 1981, while Big Jim was still on probation, Iris went to Florida to visit her sick mother. Due to the terms of his probation, Big Jim couldn't go to Florida with Iris, so he threatened her, telling her that if she didn't return to Arizona, he would kill her stepfather, who was her mother's sole caretaker. When Iris asked if she could buy her freedom, Big Jim told her it would cost $125,000, but that she could not use the money she earned from prostitution, since that money was his anyway. Iris was unable to buy her freedom, and she eventually had to return to Arizona. In March 1981, after partying all night long, Iris accidentally bumped into a parked motorcycle at a biker's bar. This made Big Jim angry, and he hit her several times. He then called one of his other old ladies to take Iris home. During the ride, Iris attempted to escape, jumping out of the car and running away when they stopped at a traffic light. She then hid behind a convenience store. Unbeknownst to her, a police car was right behind them, and the officers had seen what happened. The officers then approached Iris and were trying to figure out what was going on, while she was begging them to leave her alone. While being questioned by the police, Big Jim's other old lady went to get him, and he rode his motorcycle back to where Iris was being questioned. He convinced the officers to let him take Iris home, explaining that she had simply had too much to drink. On the way back, Iris tried to flee again by jumping off Big Jim's motorcycle when it stopped at another light. He then chased after her, and when he caught up to her, he punched her in the face repeatedly until she agreed to get back on the motorcycle. He then forcefully held her by her hair during the motorcycle ride up until they arrived home. Once they were in the driveway of their house, Iris, who was scared that Big Jim was going to kill her, started screaming in hopes of getting help from nearby neighbors. He then yelled at her to shut up, while lifting her off the ground by her chin. Big Jim's grip broke Iris's lower jaw, and she ended up passing out and losing consciousness. When she regained consciousness, she realized that she was face down on the bed. Big Jim pulled her head up by the hair and started threatening her that he would have them take her out and kill her. He held a gun to the back of her head and struck her with it, causing her to lose consciousness again. After she woke up, Iris discovered the extent of her injuries when she looked into the mirror. She had missing patches of hair and was bleeding from the mouth, eyes, and nose. She pleaded with Big Jim to allow her to go to the hospital, telling him that her jaw was broken. At first he refused, telling her that there was nothing wrong with her, but after he took a look at her jaw, he reluctantly agreed to take her to the hospital, but only if she, again, concocted a fake story which would explain her injuries. Upon medical evaluation, it was determined that Iris's jaw was broken, and she underwent surgery to have it repaired. She had a pin surgically implanted in her jaw, and had her mouth wired shut and stayed in the hospital for 6 days. While in the hospital, Big Jim visited her and would taunt her. He would take other old ladies to the hospital and would tell them that this would happen to them too if they got him angry. At one particular visit, he brought over an old lady and told her, quote, "You see what I did to her? I'm in love with her. I don't even like you, motherfucker. Go ahead and piss me off." Not long after Iris returned home from the hospital, she got out of bed one night to find Big Jim in the living room with a new old lady who was only 13 years old. To her horror, she witnessed Big Jim engaging in sexual acts with the girl. Distressed by this, Iris attempted to take her own life by swallowing as many pills as she could find. When Big Jim discovered her unconscious, he moved her from room to room and subjected her to brutal beatings with a belt for over 3 hours. Upon regaining consciousness, Iris felt an intense burning sensation in her legs, which were severely swollen and covered in bruises. The following day, with the help of a friend, she managed to escape and made her way back to her parents' home in Florida. Her parents promptly contacted the police, and Iris ultimately agreed to provide a statement. After Iris's escape in April 1981, Big Jim contacted his longtime outlaw associate Sad Sam Nail and arranged to buy another woman from him to compensate for the lost income. Big Jim once even paid $1,500 and traded a blue Cadillac for a woman to be his old lady. Since the early 1980s, 20-year-old Mary Lou Rodriguez had been spending time with the Outlaws quite frequently, particularly with Timothy Kevin Duke. On March 26th of that year, someone slashed her tires, prompting her to ask for help from the Outlaws. When the situation was not handled to her liking, Mary Lou became angry. After a heated argument with Timothy at his home, she stormed out. Reports suggested that she was set to testify in a murder case, and so Timothy, scared that Mary Lou would rat him out, said that he would kill her. In a fit of rage, Timothy tore a telephone cable off the baseboard, saying he would use the cables to strangle her. Later that evening, Mary Lou returned to Timothy's house. James Hawkins, another outlaw, said that he wanted to have sex with her before Timothy killed her. After James Hawkins had his way with Mary Lou, she went to the bathroom. Timothy followed her in and began to strangle her with the ripped telephone cord. Believing he had killed her, Timothy let her drop to the ground. However, when he released his grip, he heard her lungs fill with air again. Timothy then proceeded to grab a spear gun from his bedroom and return to the bathroom, where he shot Mary Lou in the head with it. Afterward, Timothy hid her body in a trailer on his property for several days before having James Hawkins dispose of her. James dismembered Mary Lou's body, cutting off her head, feet, and one hand before burying these parts in an undisclosed location. The rest of her corpse was dumped in a canal in South Dade. Mary Lou's decapitated and mutilated body was found in the canal by farm workers in April 1980 before she was set to testify. Authorities believed that she was one of the old ladies who knew too much. Shortly after, Timothy fled the state, and no charges were filed against him for Mary Lou's murder. However, her case played a crucial role in a RICO case that led to the downfall of the South Florida Outlaws in 1988. On October 8, 1981, a bomb explosion killed Chicago outlaw John Burrito Climbs, and rumors about other outlaws being involved began to circulate. Rene Jocko Ray was rumored to be involved in the bombing. However, he died under suspicious circumstances on May 1, 1982, in an apparent suicide. It had been reported that John attempted to leave the Outlaws, but was not allowed to do so. Rene left a note claiming he was not responsible for John's death, and suggested that someone had wanted to kill him due to his growing influence in the organization. A former member of the gang who became a government witness said that the bomb was prepared by South Florida Outlaws member Ronald Arab Watchmaker, who was an expert in explosives. However, some agents dismissed this theory, saying, quote, "I've never known one biker to deliberately kill another biker in the same club, a brother. Fights, sure. You see black eyes and bruises all the time, but I can't buy that outlaw killing outlaw theory." The other theory is that La Cosa Nostra crime figures in Chicago may have wanted John out of the way because he was threatening their business in West Side bars by employing women who were affiliated with the Outlaws as dancers and attempting to take over clubs previously controlled by the Chicago outfit. In February 1981, Michael Lee Cave, alongside another member of the Outlaws, confronted Serge Seguin in a local bar. Serge was not affiliated with the gang but had a tattoo that resembled the Outlaws' Charlie logo, featuring a skull and crossed pistons. The Outlaws began to harass him, demanding that he either remove or cover the tattoo. After Serge left the bar, they followed him into the parking lot, where one member of the Outlaws restrained him, while another attempted to cut the tattoo off with a knife. A nearby police officer intervened to break up the altercation. However, the Outlaws continued to follow Serge to another bar. After leaving the second bar, Michael and the other gang member assaulted Serge, knocking him to the ground and kicking him in the head and ribs. Michael was later charged with assault related to this incident but failed to show up for his court appearance, resulting in his bond being forfeited. As a result, the bondsman lost around $20,000. Since the Outlaws frequently used this bondsman, they were concerned that he wouldn't help them anymore, which prompted the Outlaws to pressure Michael into repaying the debt. Michael, who was hiding out in Indiana, resorted to manufacturing PCP as a way to settle the outstanding amount with the bondsman. Michael sold both PCP and marijuana and sent the money to the South Florida Outlaws so they could make payments to the bondsman. In July 1982, law enforcement conducted a raid on a PCP laboratory in Indiana, but they could not find Michael. Michael ultimately returned to Florida to continue to traffic drugs there. On July 11, 1981, Big Jim was at a Tucson biker bar called the Bashful Bandit. He and another patron, John McQuillan, got into a heated argument because Big Jim kept playing the same song on the jukebox. In the parking lot of the bar, John brandished a .38 caliber handgun, and Big Jim ended up firing 13 rounds from a 9mm handgun, striking John 8 times. John did not survive. Big Jim was arrested immediately by a police officer who witnessed the shooting, and he was charged with murder. After getting out on bail, he was arrested again by the ATF on August 25, 1981, for possessing the firearm linked to the John McQuillan shooting. Due to previous felony convictions in Florida in 1966 and 1976, Big Jim was prohibited from owning firearms, and agents found 3 guns in plain sight in his home. Big Jim's trial for federal firearms charges was initially set for November 2, 1981, but was delayed several times for various reasons. Ultimately, the trial started on March 2, 1982, after additional delays were denied. Iris Jogen testified against Big Jim and stated that he owned several firearms, and she was later placed under police protection. Ultimately, Big Jim received a 10-year sentence in 1982 for the illegal firearm possession charge. After numerous postponements, Big Jim's murder trial finally started in June 1982, and he was ultimately acquitted. The court ruled that he acted in self-defense when he killed John McQuillan. Additionally, in 1984, while still incarcerated, he received a 5-year sentence for accepting proceeds from prostitution in Arizona. Fernando Stefano, a non-outlaw, was enemies with an Outlaws leader, Clarence Michael Smith, also known as Smitty. In February of 1983, nearly 2 years after Big Jim was incarcerated for the weapons charge, Smitty's partner Bridget finished a night shift at work. As she was leaving, Fernando forced her into a van and masturbated on her, stating that was for Smitty. She believed that Fernando was an outlaw and felt as though she could not struggle and refuse his demands. Bridget then reported the incident to Smitty, who was furious. The following night, Smitty and Frederick Hegney, who was staying with him, went to Fernando's home seeking revenge. The two men broke into Fernando's home in the middle of the night and found him and his fiancée, Penny Reed, in their bedroom. Smitty had brought with him some handcuffs and he demanded that Fernando put them on, but he refused. In response, Smitty shot Fernando in the head and also shot Penny, who got hit in the hand. As Penny fell forward on the bed and pretended to be dead, she overheard Smitty saying, "They're dead in the bedroom. Kill them all." Thomas Young, Wendy James, and David Bostic had been sleeping in the living room before the outlaws broke into the home and were subsequently attacked. Frederick shot 2 of them, and Smitty shot the 3rd. By the time the police got to the house, both Penny and David were still breathing, and both survivors were immediately rushed to Broward General Hospital. David was shot twice in the back, and doctors had stated that he was dying and there was nothing they could do to save him. Police officer Don Moody went into the surgical room to see David and started asking him a few questions, specifically about the identity of his attackers. David was apprehensive about giving a statement at first. However, moments before he passed away, he gave a statement to Officer Moody and named Frederick as one of the men who attacked him. Penny was the sole survivor, and she named Smitty as the individual who shot both her and Fernando. Although murder charges were initially brought against Frederick, they were eventually dismissed with prejudice for reasons not clearly documented in the case records. Smitty was also charged with murder based on Penny's statement. However, a jury acquitted him. This case played a crucial role in the RICO case that led to the downfall of the South Florida Outlaws in 1988. The South Florida Outlaws were linked to a second bombing. However, the victim in this case was a federal witness. In February 1981, a bomb was wired to the undercarriage of Robert Collins's pickup truck. The explosive device detonated as Robert was reversing out of his driveway onto a public highway in the Algiers section of New Orleans, Louisiana. The explosion severely injured Robert, causing the loss of both his legs and much of his left hand, and he succumbed to his injuries 6 hours later due to rapid and substantial blood loss. Moments after the bombing, while lying in his driveway, Robert spoke to a police officer and identified a man named Bill Burns as the person responsible for the bombing. Just days before his death, Robert had testified in federal court against Bill Burns. Both Robert and Bill, along with a man named Kenneth Lynn, were indicted on charges of conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Robert was also scheduled to testify against Kenneth, Salvador Salido, an alleged drug dealer based in Miami, and 2 accused drug traffickers from New Orleans, Vincent Marcello and Gary Young. Despite federal investigations into these individuals, no solid physical evidence was found to link them to Robert's death, and the case remained unsolved until September 1983. That year, John Joseph J.J. Hall, the former president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club chapter in Tampa, and outlaw member Quick Carl Hawley confessed their involvement in the bombing that had killed Robert 2 years earlier. J.J. had been arrested in Buffalo, New York, on a fugitive warrant in November 1982, and was returned to Jacksonville, Florida, to stand trial with other Outlaws members for violations of the RICO Act. In May 1983, J.J. made an agreement with the government where he would plead guilty to second-degree murder in a different murder he was involved in and fully cooperate with federal investigators who were looking into the Outlaws, among other things. In return, the federal government agreed to place J.J. in the witness security program and give him immunity for the bombing in exchange for his full cooperation in the investigation. Around this time, J.J. wrote to Carl, who was incarcerated in Alabama, urging him to cooperate with the government. Carl then negotiated his own deal with federal authorities. In September 1983, Carl traveled with federal agents to New Orleans, where they agreed that in exchange for his testimony, Carl would be able to plead guilty to manslaughter for his role in Robert's murder. At the Orleans Parish District Attorney's office, Carl provided a detailed interview to the DEA, ATF, an Assistant United States Attorney, the FBI, and his attorney. Karl then took detectives on a tour of the city to retrace his movements at the time of the murder and to identify key locations. Based on the information provided by JJ and Karl, Smitty and a man named Anthony Sire were arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Robert. What happened according to both JJ and Karl is as follows. JJ managed HHH Enterprises, an unincorporated Tampa-based confederation, with outlaw members James Hawkins and Wilson Roadblock Harrell. They were responsible for distributing cocaine to other outlaws members for retail sale. This cocaine was either supplied or fronted by their contact in Hialeah, Florida, Anthony Sire. HHH Enterprises owed Anthony around $30,000 for drugs, and so James asked Anthony in January 1981 if there were any jobs the outlaws could do to reduce their debt to him. A few weeks later, James returned from Hialeah with a note containing information about federal witness Robert Collins. James and JJ were instructed to hit Robert in Algiers. The contract to kill Robert was priced at $12,000. JJ and James decided to subcontract the murder to outlaw members Carl Hawley and Richard Cheesy Craparata and split the money between them. Carl and Richard then traveled from Tampa to New Orleans with various weapons. The two men scouted Robert's home and figured out his pattern of movement around the city. However, they decided that they would not go through with shooting Robert because there were a lot of potential witnesses around, and they decided to return to Tampa a week later instead. They reported back and mentioned that they had found Robert but couldn't carry out the murder. JJ told James to let Anthony know. After he returned from Hialeah, James said that they were given an extension on the contract. In February 1981, JJ made the decision to send Karl back to New Orleans. Rather than sending Richard along, he chose Smitty, the regional president of the Outlaws at the time, to carry out the hit with him. JJ called Ed Lackey, a regional treasurer for the Outlaws who was living in Jacksonville, Florida, and instructed him to provide Karl and Smitty with weapons, explosives, whatever they needed. The two men then left for Jacksonville in JJ's Chevrolet Nova. Smitty claimed to have experience with explosives from his military service, and when Karl described the layout of Robert's home and truck, Smitty suggested using explosives. In Jacksonville, they stopped at Ed Lackey's home, where they obtained plastic explosives, a cylinder, and blasting caps. While Karl and Ed watched, Smitty, and a man who went by the nickname Fuzzy, tested the blasting caps at the back of Ed's property by burying one in the ground and firing it. They discovered the cap worked with a delay of a few seconds after being energized from a battery source. After about 2 hours in Jacksonville, Karl and Smitty left for New Orleans. On the way, they stopped at various truck stops to purchase supplies, such as alligator clips and rubber gloves, which were needed to wire the detonators. Just before entering Louisiana, they stopped at a roadside rest area and partially assembled the bomb. After arriving in New Orleans, they checked into a motel for a few hours before driving to Algiers so Smitty could check out the layout of Robert's home. That night, Karl and Smitty returned to Algiers to survey the area, and once there, they decided to proceed with their plan. Just down the street from Robert's house, they completed assembling the bomb. Smitty then took the bomb, walked to Robert's home, attached it to the undercarriage of Robert's pickup truck, and wired it to detonate when Robert applied the brakes. Meanwhile, Karl drove around the block several times, making short stops. Once Smitty finished, he walked away from the home along the highway, where Karl picked him up. Afterward, they went back to the motel and turned on the TV, and waited for news reports about the bombing until the following morning. When Karl and Smitty returned to JJ's home in Tampa, he called James to inform him that the contract had been completed. James then contacted Anthony, who arranged a meeting at a Howard Johnson's restaurant on Interstate 75 near Ocala, Florida. JJ drove to the meeting with Smitty, Carl Hawley, and Carl Harry, a probationary member of the Outlaws, but sat alone with Anthony and his associate, Carmen Trousseau, at a separate booth. The two men then discussed the hit. When Anthony asked for confirmation, JJ told him that Karl and Smitty had seen the news of the murder on a TV newscast before leaving New Orleans. After discussing the debt JJ and James owed Anthony, it was decided that they would deduct the contract amount from the balance. Following the meeting, Anthony notified James that the people were real pleased about New Orleans. Anthony Sire and Clarence Smitty Smith were both eventually sentenced to death for the murder of Robert Collins. As there was no physical evidence linking the two men to the bombing, the prosecution heavily relied on the testimonies of JJ and Karl. Due to this, Anthony and Smitty's murder convictions were eventually overturned. After spending 9 years on Louisiana's death row, Smitty was acquitted at a retrial. Anthony pleaded guilty to manslaughter while maintaining his innocence, and was immediately released in 1994 in exchange for time served. On June 1986, James Big Jim Nolan, along with most of the Outlaws' South Florida chapter, were indicted in a federal racketeering case that implicated them in a series of crimes from 1970 to 1985. The indictment outlined over 100 alleged predicate acts, which included drug trafficking, robbery, kidnapping, prostitution, extortion, and murder. In September of the same year, FBI and local SWAT teams started rounding up the outlaws. The operation kicked off early in the morning when SWAT teams from the FBI and Broward Sheriff's Office surrounded the Outlaws clubhouse on Southwest 40th Avenue and the homes of 3 members in the surrounding area. The clubhouse, who had several outlaws and their old ladies, was awoken by a ringing phone, which an FBI agent used to inform them that they were surrounded. After those inside were arrested, and in a subsequent raid of the clubhouse, agents confiscated a range of automatic weapons, including a loaded Uzi submachine gun, along with various handguns and ammunition. Michael Lee Cave was already serving a 10-year sentence for assault and drug-related offenses, and Big Jim was already serving a 10-year sentence on firearms charges. Both Ellenson Thompson and Norman Reisinger were not at the clubhouse or anywhere in the area at the time, as they were fugitives up until 1993 and 1991 respectively. James Starrett, Timothy Duke, Michael Lee Cave, Donald Sears, James Thomas Nolan, and Frederick Hegney all went to trial for violating the conspiracy provision of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act based on their roles in the Hells Angels murders, the extortion of Joyce Karleen, the kidnapping and extortion of Tina Wittenstein and Vaughn Foreman, the extortion of Iris Geoghegan, the murders and attempted kidnapping of Fernando Stefano, Thomas Young, Wendy James, and David Bostic, the extortion of Serge Seguin, the murder of Mary Lou Rodriguez, the Susan Bacon murder, the kidnapping and murder of Naomi Sinokub, and various prostitution and narcotics offenses. Jury selection began on December 10, 1987, and the racketeering trial started on January 27, 1988, during which prosecutors painted Big Jim as a man driven by an insatiable desire for power and money. After a trial that extended over a year, the jury delivered its verdict on January 23, 1989. The jury convicted Big Jim, Frederick Hegney, Donald Sears, and Michael Lee Cave on all counts related to substantive RICO violations and RICO conspiracies. Additionally, Frederick Hegney was found guilty on 3 counts related to narcotics. James Starrett and Timothy Duke were only found guilty of conspiracy. During Big Jim's sentencing hearing in Miami on October 23, 1989, his attorney presented 5 character witnesses, including ministers and members of Christian motorcycle groups, who testified that he was a genuine born-again Christian. One witness, Reverend Daniel Burgoyne, spoke about witnessing Big Jim in deep emotional prayer during jail ministry, saying he would be sobbing and crying before God, and that he never missed a church service or Bible study. However, Assistant U.S. Attorney Teresa Van Vliet was doubtful of this transformation. This was due to the fact that whenever Big Jim would be given leniency, he would promise to distance himself from the outlaws, and he obviously does not. She said, quote, "He's made promises throughout his life that he's going to be a good boy, be a productive member of society, but his track record shows he can't." In October 1989, Big Jim received a 50-year federal prison sentence, with U.S. District Judge William J. Zlock recommending that he not be eligible for parole until he has fully served all 50 years. He was given an extra 10 years because he was a special dangerous offender. Frederick Hegney's total sentence amounted to 40 years, with a mix of consecutive and concurrent terms. Both Michael Lee Cave and Donald Sears were sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 20 years. Timothy Duke was given a 20-year sentence, and James Starrett received a 13-year sentence. The once dominant South Florida chapter of the Outlaws experienced a significant decline in its influence during Big Jim's incarceration, with membership plummeting to fewer than a dozen members by the time of his sentencing in 1989. According to Assistant U.S. Attorney Gregory Kehoe, they fell off when Jim went to jail and then he went to Arizona. They never had another leader like Jim. This sentiment was echoed by Broward County Sheriff's Office Sergeant Bob Faulkner, who stated, "I don't think they'll ever have a leader again with the charisma of Jim Nolan." After serving 26 years of his sentence, 74-year-old James Big Jim Nolan was released from prison on October 21, 2016. Meanwhile, 76-year-old Frederick Yankee Hagney spent time in a Miami halfway house on March 2017 before being fully released the following month. Thank you for watching.